Hello, my name is Morten Koch, and I'm sitting here with the American architect Richard Gage and the retired lecturer in chemistry from Copenhagen University, Niels Harrit. Richard, you founded Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth back in 2006. Can you tell us what is the purpose?
What we want the public to know is that we had 3 towers fall that day. We want them to know that this 3rd tower has been censored on the mainstream media and that they don't know about the 3rd worst structural failure in modern history. In fact, most architects and engineers don't even know about it. I didn't know about it until I heard David Ray Griffin talking about it in 2006. I had to stop my car when I was listening to this interview because I was shocked that this evidence that he was citing, I had never come across any of it. You would think, well, why didn't I'm an architect. This is the 3rd worst structural failure in modern history. And yet I knew nothing about it. I started asking around my friends, my colleagues. They didn't know anything about it either. I had to go to that presentation, which had 600 people who knew something about it, who were there. I couldn't even get into David Ray Griffin's event that night. But I began to put the pieces together, PowerPoint slides from Stephen Jones, and I took them to the other 14 architects that I worked with after a couple of months. And I presented this. I had to buy them pizza to get them to come and watch this. And so they were all there. And they had been calling me all kinds of interesting names.
Crackpot.
Like that one, conspiracy theorist. But all of them, after seeing Building 7 come down and the Twin Towers, and we'll talk about what they looked like as they were coming down also, they agreed with me. All 15 of them. 14 of them signed the petition. The other one was my boss. He was Middle Eastern. He didn't feel comfortable signing petitions at that time.
What made you come to the conclusion that something isn't right with the official explanation?
Well, the official explanation tells us that 3 skyscrapers came down at virtually free fall acceleration. The 2 Twin Towers in 12 seconds. Their structure is completely shattered from top to bottom. In the case of Building 7, the 3rd skyscraper, this building came down in 7 seconds at free fall acceleration. And we're told that that happened due to normal office fires. And so the 2,300 architects and engineers that I represent don't buy it at all, because not only could that not even happen, but there's evidence of incendiaries throughout the World Trade Center, debris piles and dust.
You say there's evidence. What kind of evidence did you find? Have you found?
Well, there's molten iron pouring out of the South Tower 10 minutes prior to its collapse, which can't be anything but molten iron or steel. It turns out to be molten iron. There's molten iron flowing like lava. The first responders describe it as steel.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like it was lava
from a volcano.
The World Trade Center structural engineer himself, Leslie Robertson, describes a river of steel. All of this evidence, for which we have photographic and video evidence plentiful to eyewitness testimony, it has to be looked at, acknowledged, looked at, analyzed, and all of this is missing from the official reports. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain the collapse of these 3 buildings, ejected this material from the original FEMA report, in which there was forensically documented sulfur contamination, sulfur corrosion, hot temperature, molten iron at the ends of these beams, partially evaporated, says Jonathan Barnett, the author of this FEMA report in 2002, Appendix C. And yet when NIST came in, they took this complete section out of their final report. They took out the hundreds of witnesses of explosions.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor, I heard some more explosions. You know,
Also the sound?
like a boom, like an explosion.
And more than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs, we made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
And the whole time you hear him thum, 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 thum. So, I think I know an explosion when I hear it, you know? I was real close to Building 7 when it fell down, and I don't know, but that didn't sound like just a building falling down to me while I was running away from it. There's a lot of eyewitness testimony down there hearing explosions. I didn't see any reason for that building to fall down the way it did, and a lot of guys should be saying the same thing.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds, you heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
Like the firemen were describing, pop, 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 all the way around the building, like a belt, all these explosions. So hundreds of witnesses expunged from the official reports. And the behavior of the buildings themselves in the videos, for instance, Building 7, it drops as fast as I'm dropping this object. That means no resistance. There was 40,000 tons of structural resistance, the steel frame, in that building. And yet all of a sudden, at once, without warning, it completely gives up as if it weren't even there. All 80 columns in that building had to have been cut, systematically, synchronistically timed for at least 8 floors for that building to fall as far as it did at free fall. In the case of the Twin Towers, we don't have a stack of 110 floors at the bottom of either of these towers. Each of these towers are 110 floors high. They had floors that were an acre in size, and yet they fall without any evidence of the floors being down at the bottom. What happened to them? Well, they're being pulverized systematically, floor by floor, in midair. Concrete pulverized to 100 micron particles. Dust laid from river to river like a blanket, 12 to 20 centimeters thick.
The molten iron.
This is the dust from the concrete, the gypsum, and all of the other building components that were laid from river to river, about 20 centimeters thick.
What experience made you look at 9/11 with new eyes? Niels?
Well, the fact that I couldn't understand why this building collapsed. I'm talking about Building 7 now. And if you could eventually sum up Richard's account of the technical aspects of the collapse of World Trade Center, I would refer to the fact that science, and I'm a scientist, is based on experience. And according to experience, a steel frame high-riser does not collapse for any reason. One thing is that it doesn't collapse due to fire, but are you aware of any steel frame building collapse for any reason? Earthquakes? No. They may tip over, but they do not collapse. So steel frame high-risers do not collapse. And experience is the hard substance of science. Natural science is based on experience. And according to experience, steel frame high-risers do not collapse. And that's our starting point. By gravity alone. You have to help them along, and this is what happened to these 3 high-rises.
Richard, in 2013, you raised more than $400,000 for an advertising campaign that were launched in 7 American countries, and you even went to Vancouver, Toronto, London, and even Japan. How did that go?
What we have is a publicity problem. We need to tell the American people and people all around the world in this campaign you're referring to that there was a third skyscraper that came down on 9/11. So we simply asked the question, did you know a third tower fell on 9/11? Rethink 9/11. The evidence might surprise you. And it always does. We thought that was an intriguing campaign to put up on video billboards. In fact, in Times Square, we had a huge billboard. I think it was 100 feet high or something. And it got a lot of attention. It got some mainstream media attention. It got people's attention on the street. I think 1 million of them saw it. So we hope it was effective. When you gauge the effectiveness of the 9/11 truth movement, it's a little bit like, sometimes like watching a swimming pool fill. You just don't see that progress, you know, month after month, year after year. But you go away and come back, and all of a sudden, something's different, you know. The level is higher. The level of awareness in the unconscious or subconscious of the American people is higher. We go out on the street now, and half of them are aware that there's an issue, at least. They'd heard something from a friend. They'd seen a movie. They heard the controversy. Half of those can cite half the points of the evidence that we talked about today. So that's a lot different than 5 or 6 years ago. So campaigns like the Rethink 9/11 campaign make a big difference. We're also reaching in to the American Institute of Architects, of which I'm a member, which accounts for or represents 80,000 American architects. And we have now submitted successfully a resolution, which was well written and which was submitted with 50 members, our members, who are also AIA members. So they had to accept it, and now they have to debate semi-publicly in a meeting with 300 delegates with the at the American Institute of Architects convention in Atlanta on May 16. That is a historic opportunity for a plenum of people semi-publicly now, instead of in 2002, 2003, where the American Institute of Architects officially gave their endorsement of the NIST report of the Twin Towers destruction. That's 2004. So we've put them between a rock and a hard place. The truth, the exposure of their blind endorsement to their members, and their board, who has been ignoring us for 8 years now.
What do you think will come from the vote in AIA, American Institute of Architects?
Well, we're pretty excited. What we hope will happen is that they will be forced to debate it openly, and that those who hear that debate will be compelled by their conscience to respond according to the evidence, because we also hope we'll be there for 2 minutes to present the evidence for Building 7, of which this resolution calls for a reinvestigation of, and that they'll see Building 7 coming down at free fall acceleration, and realize, as any thinking person does, that A, it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, B, it smells like a controlled demolition, C, it must be a controlled demolition. So since they told us it came down by normal office fires, and that those office fires are few and small and scattered, that none of it adds up, and we do, in fact, need a reinvestigation.
And then there's the whole, it got so hot in there that the metal, it got so soft that it collapsed into itself in a spiral and it went down and was there. I've heard that several times.
Maybe I could make a little comment on the issue of temperature.
Yeah.
Because as Richard mentioned before, the firefighters and the policemen were talking about, and the first responders were talking about streams and pools of molten steel. Not correct. It is true that what they observed was molten iron, and steel is predominantly iron. But the iron observed pouring out of the South Tower and in the rubble was not from the steel, but this is the primary product of the thermite reaction. It produces molten iron. And this is what you're seeing running out of the building prior to the collapse of the South Tower. Now, regarding the temperature of the steel structure, there's also plenty of misunderstandings and outright lies around that.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat. And architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
As a starting point, we could go into the NIST report. The Appendix E of the NIST report, they describe the temperature of the steel beams as it was monitored due to the cracking of the fire protection paint. They isolated a very small fraction of the steel beams, which was given up to a private company to investigate the paint afterwards. And what paint does when it's being warmed up, it forms what is called mud cracks, mud cracking. It cracks like mud in a riverbed. And from that, you can determine the temperature the beam has been exposed to. If you go down the tables and you see what their conclusion are, there are no temperatures beyond 250 degrees centigrade. Now, this is the steel being monitored by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. On the other side, in the dust, there are residues. I will not go into the chemistry here, details, but there are residues which unambitiously point towards temperatures actually far beyond 2,500 degrees. You see molten aluminum spheres, molybdenum spheres. And molybdenum melts, if I recall it, 2,860 degrees centigrade. You have boiling silicate. That is, now you are beyond 3,000 degrees centigrade. So that means that very, very locally, there's been extreme temperatures, which is needed for cutting the steel columns. And this is where thermate come in. It's an incendiary which undoubtedly was used for cutting down the steel beams. But the vast majority of the steel was not exposed to terribly high temperatures. They were cut, at my judgment, every third floor downwards. Every third story, it was cut into pieces which fitted to the trucks which were supposed to come in and pick it up. But the majority in terms of volume of the steel was not particularly hot. So when the first workers talk about molten steel, it's because this was what they knew. They were not chemists. But the fact is that the molten iron we are seeing is coming from the thermite being used in this process, and also there are two kinds of thermite involved. Because the stuff that we have discovered, and I'm talking about this group, Professor Stephen E. Jones, is a different brand. I do not personally believe, but now we are into hypothetical hypothesis. I do not personally believe that it was used to cut the steel beams. It served a different purpose, but there's no doubt it was there due to the abundance of iron spheres found in the dust. And this was a complete independent investigation conducted in 2003 by an independent company. So these are the three issues. When you started talking about temperature, I just want to step in and straighten things out.
an incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
In fact, it's the USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, themselves that finds billions of iron microspheres, previously molten iron microspheres, in all the World Trade Center dust sample. They made it a signature component of those dust samples. In fact, it's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these unexplained, previously molten iron microspheres in them. In these mass quantities, up to 6% of some of the dust samples are previously molten iron microspheres, and yet they have no explanation as to where they came from. R.J. Lee, an independent consulting firm doing toxicological studies on the dust, also finds and documents them. Independent researchers like Stephen Jones find and document them. And so what else they find is small red-gray chips in the World Trade Center dust, which Niels Harrit has done an exceptional job documenting. And when those chips are put in a differential scanning calorimeter at 420 degrees centigrade, they ignite. What do they produce when they ignite? They produce the same spheres, iron microspheres, with the same chemical signature of those that are found in the World Trade Center dust. So we know where those spheres came from. They came from those chips, and perhaps you could elucidate on the chips.
That is a decisive experiment you're describing. The chips are reacting, and that's it. That's a thermite reaction. There's a long paper Richard was referring to, and we should not bother you with all the technical details which comes along. But the pertinent observation is the formation of iron spheres when the red-gray chips react, and that's it. That's
red-gray chips, the small chips that you call nanothermite. That's
a term we introduced because we understand how the material actually is produced. We cannot synthesize exactly the same stuff because we don't know the nature of the polymer involved. But we know that research into energetic materials based on nanotechnology was conducted in the military laboratories facilities since the early 1990s in the United States and France, Britain as well, in particular at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And even though it's military research, our colleagues there, if they're allowed to make announcements and they make reports and they also apply for funding, and they appear at conferences. We have something called conference proceedings about what they have talked about. So we totally understand the underlying chemical principles of how this stuff is produced. But of course there's plenty going on which is military secrets, which we do not know. But we understand the chemistry. It's called sol-gel technology, sol-gel chemistry. And it is widely used in nanotechnology, which is fundamentally different from old-time technology when you're just pouring things together. In nanotechnology, you're building materials from the bottom up, from the atomic and molecular level, which has many advantages, and you can do magic this way. And you can make explosives, and you can make rocket fuel, and you can make incendiaries. You can actually tune the properties of these material for whatever purpose you want in this field of destruction.
Dr. Harrit is, of course, referring to the millimeter or so size multi-layered chips, red on one side, gray on the other, that are found in all of the independently collected samples that his international team was given. The four independently collected samples from the World Trade Center dust. And that's where they zoomed in with is it a nuclear microscope?
No, electron microscope.
Electron microscope, same thing.
Not quite.
No, I don't know.
Not quite.
But 50,000 times is the power that was used to zoom in. And what they found, of course, inside is evenly mixed evenly mixed rhomboidally shaped iron oxide particles and aluminum platelets, less than 100 nanometers in size, which makes it an extremely sophisticated material, as he was describing, that's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. So you can begin to see why we have such trouble with the official story, because this material should not be in the World Trade Center dust, nor should there be billions of molten iron microspheres that obviously came from these chips.
But I don't think there's so much more to add. Actually, maybe I would like to turn it down a little. Because in my opinion, is the free fall of Building 7 much more profound because of the free fall acceleration. As Richard Gage pointed out, when you're seeing the top roof falling at free fall acceleration 9.88 meters per second squared for the first 2.3 seconds. And the beauty of this story, if there is any beauty to it at all, is that the conclusion from here goes back to the first experiment ever carried out in natural science, quantitative experiments, systematic experiments, by Galileo Galilei in 1593. He did the first experiments ever carried out in science from the Leaning Tower in Pisa. He was throwing out different objects of different sizes, while actually the whole village was watching this crazy guy, and measuring its time of fall. And out of these experiments, which is considered the birth of natural science, came two laws. The first one says that all objects fall at the same speed, which may be intuitive, counterintuitive. And the other thing is that the falling length is proportional to the time squared. You may not appreciate that, but if you manipulate a little bit with this during mathematics, you go into Newton's second law of motion, which came out in 1687 in a book called Principia, which is the most important book in natural science, by many considered. You know the laws, Newton's laws of motion. And these are the very laws which is being violated by the official account, by saying that the Building 7 is coming down due to fire is defying Galileo and Newton. And we have Newton on our team, and he has never lost a game.
If Building 7 came down in 7 seconds, then it's coming down at free fall acceleration. And the videos show exactly that. It comes down in under 7 seconds. That means that all 80 columns in this building had to have been cut at once. And the question is, does fire have that level of precision? And it does not. Never has, never will. Fire is an organic process. It moves through a building every 20 minutes or so, burning out one area, looking for fresh new fuel sources. So when a building comes down due to fire, and as Niels suggested, never have we lost a skyscraper due to fire, but say in a wood frame building, it would begin to tip over, it would come down in stages, it would be a chaotic natural process. And of course that's not what we see in the videos of Building 7. what it looks like, in addition to free fall, is a controlled demolition. That we have hundreds of examples of controlled demolitions from all around the world to draw from. And so, since it looked exactly like a controlled demolition, and since fire never has brought down a skyscraper, we would have expected NIST, the bastion of science in our country, to look seriously at the hypothesis of controlled demolition and maybe fire as a secondary alternative hypothesis. But they completely ignore controlled demolition as a hypothesis and sought with immeasurable exaggeration and fraud to justify their hypothesis of destruction by fire.
How did Osama bin Laden and all his friends do this?
We don't have conspiracy theories to offer. We're saying to the Danish people, please open your eyes. Look at the physical evidence. We can't ignore this any longer. 2 major wars were started immediately after 9/11. 6,000 US soldiers, and I don't know how many Danish soldiers were killed in those wars, and a couple of million Afghanis and Iraqis. We've lost our civil liberties in the US with the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the National Defense Authorization Act, in which any of us can be arrested, held indefinitely without charge, without a trial, without a right to a lawyer. And we can be even tortured and assassinated. This is not what our forefathers fought for. So I'm not sure about yours here in Denmark, but I'm sure the risks are equally grave if we don't take a sharp, cold, hard look at the facts.
Guess which country had the greatest number of casualties relative to the population?
Denmark?
Denmark. And which country is number 2 when it comes to the number of casualties relative to boots on the ground? That's a harder one. Canada. Just a footnote. And they were in Helmand province, which was really the hottest part of it. So we're only 6.5 million around it. That's why we come in number 1st in this. 43 servicemen and women lost their lives.
Richard, how has it been for you going into the public with your theories? How has your friends, your colleagues and family reacted?
Well, we have the evidence that these 3 skyscrapers were brought down by controlled demolition. And as you suggest, it's not enough. It wasn't enough to save my marriage. My own wife finally agreed that what we're talking about is controlled demolition. But I can't walk this path with you. It points to some dark places in our society, and many people don't want to acknowledge that. So in the case of my marriage, I had to let it go to pursue this path, because we're talking about saving our country in the US, and maybe here in Denmark too, from forces that are so much greater than we had imagined and have so much more power and do things that we couldn't have imagined that they could do and get away with. And whoever they are, we're probably not talking about 19 fundamentalist hijackers who got into the 3 skyscrapers to set these explosives. We're talking about something far greater and far more sinister. And we don't, as I mentioned, have conspiracy theories here, but we're not stupid. We're not naive. We recognize that we're up against something that we need a lot of help with. But we realize that we have the force of truth on our side. We ride the wave of something greater than that which perpetrated 9/11. We don't know what that is. but we know we're not alone.
Niels, why is it so important for you to inform your fellow beings on what occurred on September 11, 2001?
And the point is that the story we are telling is painful. Because once you have seen 7 going down, you get a sensation that there's something wrong here, and your immediate reaction is that maybe I shouldn't look into this, because this may lead me to places where I do not want to go. Fact is that we do not want to be lied to, and we do not want to lie ourselves, both. So if you realize that the people who we have selected, either by election or by fate, our parents, have lied to us to an extent that is so beyond imagination to ordinary people, is very painful, actually. But as a consequence, since now we have something that we're not supposed to talk about, is downright destructive to our Western civilization. You can blow up any good company by either start to discussing politics, religion, or 9/11. Mm-hmm. Yeah, then it's not fun anymore, because usually people divide on this subject, and there's something here we cannot talk about. That means the language is deteriorating, and this is what you've seen observed with Western culture in the last 12 years, in my least. We're ending up like Eastern Europe was 20 years ago, gray and gray and gray, absolutely nothing's happening, because if you have the secret police sitting next to you in the bus, there are something you do not talk about. And we have the same situation here. The mechanism how we got here we could discuss later on, but fact is, here is a subject which we are not supposed to talk about, which means that everybody knows that everybody knows that everybody knows that everybody knows that we should not talk about this, particularly in the mainstream media. And how this operates, you have to, actually in practice, you have to interview other people about. But as a consequence, it's true, marriages are breaking up, families are breaking up, parents are not talking with their children, children are not talking with their parents because of this. So you end up with a society which is soaked with fear and lies. We accept the lies. Downright lies for going into the war in Afghanistan, and Denmark has been involved in total of 7 wars in 2001. So we have a society of lies and fear, and all power is based on fear. And all wars are based on deception, and wars is the most profitable business of all.
Richard, you have given more than 350 presentations since 2006. What has this change been over the last 9 years?
Yeah, we're heading to Amsterdam, Berlin, London, Paris, Lausanne, Vienna, Rome, and Budapest also. And what we hope for is that the people will come to those presentations, of course, but in addition to that, we have several interviews like this one set up so that thousands, if not millions of people, depending on the media who comes and covers us, will be exposed to the evidence. Because once people are contaminated with the truth, it has a hard time hiding itself.
What are your hopes for the future? Do you have any visions?
I hope that there are courageous people in government who step forward out on a limb and aren't afraid to speak the truth, and those in media as well, and academia. And until we have such brave individuals who have so much to lose, inspired by that truth, I just have to keep putting one foot in front of the other until that happens. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what the future holds for us. I'm very concerned about the direction of our society based on fear and the loss of our civil liberties and an environment where people are afraid to speak the truth. That doesn't work for me either.
What do you think we could do as common people?
Push every button. And that is the beauty of the 9/11 truth movement. You do not go out and look for 9/11. 9/11 finds you. And 9/11 found Richard in a car on his way home when he heard a radio interview with David Ray Griffin. And he's an architect, so this is what he does. 9/11 found me at the chemistry department at the University of Copenhagen. So I'm a chemist, so that is what I do. So 9/11 finds you wherever you are, and you have to push every button which is within reach in time and space. And that is the beauty of it. I get a lump in my throat every time I think of the millions of people all over the world just doing what they can do, where 9/11 finds them in time and space. And this is our individual responsibility, to do what we can do. So just look in front of you and do what you can do, and we'll reach critical mass.
Some people will send the AE911truth.org link to every architect, engineer they can find, the media officials, elected representatives, everybody they know. That would reach millions of people if everybody did just that, sitting at home in front of their computer. The computer is a powerful instrument. The internet is an amazing vehicle for the spread of truth. In this case, the truth about 9/11. Everybody can do something. People will leaflet in the snow in front of Parliament here in Denmark.
You don't even need expertise. I mean, if I'm watching on YouTube 2 kids in Cardiff, and what they're doing is they're printing flyers and they're doing DVDs, and they're going down in mainstream of Cardiff, passing out DVDs and flyers, I get a lump in my throat, because this is exactly the same thing as we are doing. Everybody's pushing the buttons within their reach in time and space, and this is where it's coming from, the people bottom up. And that's why truth will prevail. Both Richard and I frequently are being asked the question, why are you doing this? Right? Yeah. Personally, why am I doing this? For several reasons. One is that I'm opposed to crime. It's as simple as that. I'm a big advocate of law and order. In my opinion, crimes should be investigated by the police, who collect the evidence, which usually is being presented for a court. In America, you call a grand jury, examining the evidence. Eventually, you charge a person, is brought into a courtroom. The judges evaluate the evidence, and eventually the person is being guilty and sentenced punishment. Neither of this has happened in case of the killing of 3,000 people in World Trade Center. There's never been a criminal investigation. Imagine. It has never happened. According to FBI, they don't even have evidence which connects Osama bin Laden with 9/11. And so this is actually what we basically call for, a decent, ordinary criminal investigation into the killing of 3,000 people. And we'll find out that 9/11 is key. And it is key to solving a situation which is far more severe than the killing of 3,000 people. In my opinion, our Western civilization is at a point which is as significant as the Renaissance. We are at a breaking point. So many areas, so many people feel that there is something profoundly wrong. Due to the whole financial system, our society is on the verge of collapse. And this is very serious. And our only weapon as ordinary citizens is the truth. And that is where 9/11 come in, and that is why 9/11 is key. Truth will prevail. This is, I'm sure, the fundamental belief of both Richard and I. And we were talking in the car also, why do we do this? This is not an option for people. Once you've seen 7 going down, there is no way back. You can cheat on yourself, which is very stupid. That means ignoring it. So there is, for people with some consciousness, there's only one way, and this is the road we take. There's no way back. But it's not a set game. It can go either way. And if it goes to the wrong side, we have a word for it, and this is fascist. If it goes to the good side, we do not have a word for it yet, because the alternative, the mirror image of fascism is very hard to describe, and we are into something which does not have a name yet. But the process that I see, hopefully in my lifetime, is comparable with the Renaissance. But it took 150 years because at that time everything went so slowly and they were sending letters to each other on horseback from one end to the other. Here we are talking about months, weeks, eventually hours. And all we hope for that we have reached critical mass at that time. And critical mass is a term from nuclear physics, which means that you have to be enough in order to determine the process.
Richard Gage and Niels Harrit, I would like to thank you very much for taking the time to be here, to be a part of this interview on DK Dox.
It was brilliant. Thank you,
talking with you both.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was
so
the
planet probably?
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went ba-boom, it was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, and there was a second explosion in the same building. There were two explosions.
Okay. Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was some secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now that's the first time we're hearing that. So two planes and explosives that were in the building, is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point.